One of the areas of emphasis for this series and today's session is learning from each other. So I'm going to invite folks to be vulnerable, right? Maybe share some hard knocks lessons that you've learned in real life as you've developed as a manager. I'm not going to ask that without first being vulnerable myself. One of the mistakes I've made that I continue to focus on is not having those tough conversations early enough. In my head, it's like, well, maybe this other thing was the reason. So I'm going to cut this person a little bit of slack. And oh yeah, but this have this going on in their life, or all these other competing priorities, and continue to not have that conversation. But I was given some advice years ago by a manager that said, ask me the tough question of, do you think you're helping that person by not having that conversation? And that was an eye opener for me. We are doing a disservice if we're not having that conversation early, because I think some of you mentioned in that social learning issue, people inherently want to be better. People inherently want constructive criticism of how they can improve. So have the conversation early and seek it with, Jennifer gave some good advice, right? Of seeking to understand, here's the situation. I'm going to pull in some SBI here too. Hey, here's the situation. This is the behavior I observed. This is the impact I see it having, but what's your take? Do you see it the same way, or tell me more about your perspective? And that way they can share if there are other extenuating circumstances that perhaps we don't know about. But if you have the conversation early, you're at least identifying that and not putting it off too late. So with that, I'd love for anybody else to be vulnerable, share a lesson that you've learned through your management experience about feedback and performance management.
Well, I'll go because mine's very much aligned to yours, David. And it's my personal experience when I didn't give feedback in time and you wait some time, then it becomes, the interesting thing is then the conversation becomes really hard when you're giving feedback about something that was 2 weeks ago or a month ago. And the person, you're now going to surprise them potentially. You're now actually you've missed the moment where it's still fresh in mind, where they can reflect and course correct and improve. And you've literally lost the value of kind of providing that feedback. And I've just found it's just much simpler, right? If you give feedback in the moment, it's expected. It's just part of a natural conversation. It's way more effective. And it just, frankly, I think it makes it easier on both parties to give and receive the feedback. So I remember one of the specific drivers when I don't do it, and I realized when you mentally walk through the conversation, how hard it is. And I realized, wow, that was a missed opportunity and a mistake. So the counter experience if you don't give it in a timely fashion.
Great points. Thank you, David. And Michelle, thank you for commenting in Zoom chat. Will you articulate that, please, and say more about your comment there?
Sure. I mean, making sure that the feedback is timely with and when it happened in the moment, but also in private, right? Not doing it if it's in a team setting or in a group call. All of our words have weight, and doing it publicly can be more impactful in bad ways.
Great point. Thank you. So Chris Weber, I'll call on you. I thought of several like bear puns that I could use, but I'm going to spare everybody. I won't go there.
All right. Thank you. So a couple things, right? So when I look at, being a leader and what we do, right? It's a lot of it comes down to consistency, transparency, and accountability, right? So we're consistently having one-on-ones and feedback sessions, or we should be, with our reps, right, every week or multiple times a week. And so when we're having those discussions, right, we put out what our expectations are pretty early on, pretty much from day one. This is what I expect, as far as interaction with customers and building pipeline and closing things. And so when we're having these consistent meetings, it's beholden to us to give that feedback and saying, hey, you had a kind of a light week, or maybe the last couple of weeks your pipeline gen has been off, and things have just been not really firing on all 8 cylinders here. What's going on? Like, help me understand what's going on. Do you need a little bit more training, and do you need more resources? How can I help you bring you back up to that level, versus just watching you flounder and then hope things are going to turn around on your own? And so having these consistent and these consistent feedback sessions, I think, helps bring people along and realize, hey, I got an advocate here, and I'm not just held out here on an island hoping that I could see can succeed. And then if things fall apart, oh my God, what do I do? Right. So being active and coming and bringing to them like, hey, you're falling behind or there's some deficiencies here. What can we do to help right the ship before it spirals out of control and you get buried too deep in a hole, or 10 weeks into a quarter and you have no way to figure out how to get across the finish line. It's better than saying, oh, you're deficient. We got to fix it, or we got to move to a plan. I think in my kind of way that I run things.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Yeah, consistency, always on, right? Yeah, it's so that it can be relevant, timely, specific. Love that. Jonathan, got your hand raised.
Sure do. I was just going to share that there have been times in my leadership or management career where you get so focused on where people need to improve, and if you have a large team and you're serving those people, you're coaching them, that you can sometimes then forget that there are top performers that you're taking for granted, people who are just like, you don't have to worry about them much. They're doing what they're supposed to do and they're doing it really well. But it's also really important to remember that you need to provide those individuals recognition and positive reinforcement and feedback for the work they're doing, because sometimes if you go a long period without doing so, those top performers are so critical to your team end up feeling not appreciated, and that is just as bad, that in fact I would say worse, if you end up having an attrition risk with a top performer than if you're struggling to bring a low performer and you're putting all your focus on a low performer, get sort of remediating those situations. So it's always has to be that balance.
Yeah, great points, because I think you're right. Performance management has a negative connotation to many, but it shouldn't. It doesn't. Right? It's also the positive feedback, and kind of connecting it to some of what we talked about during the last session as we think about that Drexler-Sibbitt model, right, of organizational health going from 4 to 5 to 6, and really that peak performance, right, is about celebrating those successes and that positive reinforcement. That's awesome. Sherrod, I'm calling you next, please.
Yeah, I think mine's kind of maybe in part a statement and also some learning too. But this past season, I think in leadership during COVID has been probably the most challenging that I've ever seen as a manager and as a leader, just because there's so much else going on. So I think when you've got team who are struggling, it's been really hard. And the only way that I've really seen any success through it, and I'm sure that we did plenty we could have done better, was just to keep talking to the team about all the things that are going on outside of just their performance to better understand. We've had team who've had family who've passed and a lot of really challenging situations. And I think that knowing there just hasn't been a beaten path in the same way in having kind of a formula for how to work with people in the same way there has been in other seasons. So this past season for me has just really been about communicating often, spending more time ensuring that we're asking questions of them, of individuals, and trying to find platforms to find out how each other are doing, and then using that to augment how we think about developing teams, just because this has been new for me this past year.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. And Chris Moore, I love your feedback there. Yeah, empathy, more so than ever, needed to demonstrate and lead with empathy in the last 12 months. Matthew, on to you.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, so I've just got a short one that I just want to throw in from my hat in the ring here. So, in general, as a leader, you always like to think you've got a bag full of answers, but sometimes often that expectation can get in the way of engaging where performance and feedback is required in the right kind of time. So basically, putting aside that expectation that sometimes I put on myself in terms of today, I've got to have all the answers. I've realized that actually talking through things together can be a much more important exercise than immediately kind of jumping in and saying, look, I can see what the solution is, or here's an answer, have you tried this? So really it's making sure that I put that aside and then just really focus on the individual and then work together that way out.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Let's go over to Helen.
Hello. I was going to add to what you were saying earlier, David. One thing that I learned the hard way is separating the employee from the person. So yeah, people have things going on in their personal life that can impact them, but knowing the difference between what they are still able to do and what they're not able to do, I think is really key. And you've always got to have that managerial distance, right? If you get too close, I think it really clouds your judgment. And that's something I definitely learned the hard way early on in my career.
Thank you, Helen, for sharing that. Yep, agreed. David, I know you commented on some of Matthew's comments, so I think that would be super helpful to hear from you.
Just reinforcing what Matthew said. Yeah, I mean, if they just came to me and I was, oh, here's the answer, that would just never allow them to grow and research and learn for themselves. And I mean, I know I don't have all the answers, but I mean, yeah, and even if I did, I would want to teach a person to fish as opposed to just giving them the fish. So yeah, so thank you, Matthew, for bringing that up.
Thank you, Annie.
Yeah, just going back to building trust, I think sometimes it's as simple as having an honest conversation. If somebody's not performing at the level that's expected, just ask them, are you happy? Are you happy in this job? That happened with me, and came to find out that the person didn't like carrying a quota and didn't like pressure. And in sales, those are the only two things that are guaranteed to increase and to be constants, is that you're probably going to have a quota increase and you're going to have more pressure. And it resulted with the person moving into a marketing role at another company and then checking in later and finding out that they were so much happier, because we spend so much time in our occupation and in our career that to do something that you're just not happy doing, and to just ask that simple question, is this for you? Is this the right role for you? Beside what individual, what different things you may not be attaining against, are you happy doing what we're asking of you? And it seemed like it was a huge burden relieved off of their shoulders to just say, you know what, this really isn't my gig. This isn't for me. And I think it was a great career change for that person and made them much happier in the long term. Sorry, that's my bulldog snoring in the background.
Love that example. That's great. And I see that a consistent theme of the part of our responsibility as managers is cultivate the growth and development that may or may not be in the role that they're currently in, right? And so really thinking about the whole person, and it's not just about responsibilities in the current role, but what makes them happy, what makes them tick, where do they want to get to in the future? So thank you, Annie. Jim.
Thanks, Summers. I had two things. One was building off of what Helen, I think the phrase she used, separating the person from the employee. And I would characterize also separating the person from the performance, such that the coaching is taken not as a personal attack on that person, but around the performance that exists. Jack Welch, I remember a story that Jeffrey Emmelt, who took over as chairman of GE from Jack Welch, said that Jack had given him feedback. Jeff, I love you as a person, but if you don't get the plastics division profitable, I'm going to find someone who can. So being able to have those tough conversations, but focus on the performance, not the person. Second example I would give is that coaching can go both ways. So a person who's actually on JKS's team today, back when I was leading that person, I had given her what I thought was some praise and a real pat on the back. And the following day, she came back and gave me some feedback that the way I had presented the information actually had a little bit of a negative impact on her. And that was great that we had the level of trust that she was willing to give me that feedback. So I'd challenge all of us, are we also seeking coaching from our people so it's seen as bidirectional?
Yeah, I love that, Jim. And that builds upon what we've talked about, right, the past couple of sessions, is that had you not established and cultivated an environment of trust, that conversation may have never happened, which meant they may not have felt safe sharing that with you, which may have meant you didn't develop and get a learning from that. So that's great. Thank you. Tim.
Yeah, I heard a story one time about a dad who was watching his son in a karate lesson, and there were 20 kids. They were all doing the same exact motion, and he was watching his son, and he was super embarrassed because his son was had everything wrong going on in this very simple motion. And the karate instructor was walking around the room and he would just slowly adjust his son's foot. And the dad's like, why are you changing his foot? Like, everything about my kid is wrong right now. But, a few minutes later, he would come back over and adjust the son's shoulder. And slowly and iteratively, things began to improve. And by the end of it, his son was perfectly doing this motion. And I was thinking about that in light of what Chris was saying, of like that early and kind of that frequent time spent with your team is so important, because if you have that time, you can just slowly adjust things. So that way you don't have to deal with the bigger ramifications when a lot of things are going wrong. So it's been helpful for me to slowly focus on, all right, what things can we iteratively improve upon and celebrate those wins as well.
That's a great story, Tim. Thank you. Thank you to everybody that's been vulnerable and taken a moment to share your insights and your experiences. Hope everybody got some nuggets from that. I certainly did.